Stand over closest.
Yeah, can do. Okay. Hi everyone. So yeah, as Paul explained, I tend to work a lot with sort of software development teams these days. I've worked in security for a long time, but most of my time these days is spent working with clients on sort of improving their secure development lifecycle. Hopefully you can hear me all right. I've got a microphone, but I do talk quite quietly sometimes. So moving on then. So obviously the theme of this event is very much in line with that. It's about kind of integrating sort of, working with proactive security, kind of working with development teams and what they can do rather than sort of us as cybersecurity experts telling them what to do. It's kind of like doing security for yourself, very much. So on that note, it's very good to sort of be able to do a talk about this. My notes are actually on my laptop over there, so I apologize because I'm going to try to remember everything that I said I was going to say. Fortunately, I've got slides with quite a lot of content, so it should be okay. So brief introduction then. It's nice to be speaking at an OWASP event again because I did actually used to run the OWASP Newcastle chapter for a while. I did that for about 4 years. And I've also got experience of running the IC Squared North East England chapter as well recently. But please be kind though, because I haven't actually done a talk since sort of pre-COVID, which I think is in line with the last time we had an OWASP Manchester meeting actually. Currently employed at NCC Group. For the last couple of years, I've kind of been working a lot with development teams, clients with development teams. And the main purpose of this talk is to share experiences of that. If I could sort of get any message across, it's kind of not so much what threat modeling is, it's more about kind of how to approach development teams, in internal organizations when you want them to actually start doing threat modeling as a process where they've not previously kind of done it before. So that's pretty much it. So it's very much kind of observations, lessons learned. Imagine yourself, basically trying to create a new threat modeling process at a client or as an internal org. You're trying to embed that process. You're basically, the circumstances, the scenario is that you've got development teams that have not really done this before, or maybe they've done a little bit, but not a lot. And you're kind of tasked with kind of, integrating that new process that you've created. It's not so much to talk about how to do threat modeling, because I feel like that's been done a lot in the past anyway. So it's kind of, this isn't really sort of a how-to. I'm not going to go through like Stride, Pasta, Dread, and all of those things, but in terms of modeling methods, but what we'll do is give enough of an overview that hopefully you can kind of follow what I'm talking about. So in terms of the agenda, it's 4 points really. So the first thing is really kind of the value of integrating threat modeling with SDLC. So if you come back to that sort of scenario I've painted, very much, you're kind of tasked with sort of integrating threat modeling with an organization. What is the kind of key message that you want to give, senior management and the development teams themselves? It's kind of like the why, it's the value, not so much the how. So I'll kind of go through some of that. And then I've used quite a lot of different sort of threat modeling tools over the years, and I've got a few opinions that I'd like to kind of share with you. I'm not going to name names necessarily in terms of the tools, but what I will do is kind of describe different classes of sort of threat modeling tools and some of the capabilities and some of the kind of pitfalls to watch out for if you're thinking of kind of selecting a tool in your organization or on behalf of a client. Another thing is, and this is the last 2 points are the key ones really, it's kind of like what kind of challenges do you get when you approach like a product engineering organization? What kind of pushback do you get when you're trying to integrate this new process? So I've kind of worked with a FTSE 100, for example, with about 4,500 developers or engineers. So I've got some experiences to draw from that. I've recently worked with sort of a European organization with about 2,000 developers and an American one as well. So I've kind of got experiences from different types of organizations where, sort of integrating what seems like a great idea to us as cybersecurity professionals in an organization is not actually that straightforward. You tend to get the sort of very similar kind of debates and sort of pushback. And so I'll mention that. And then what I'll do is kind of give you some sort of options in terms of kind of like key messaging and approaches to try to kind of overcome and sort of win over the development organization. So very briefly then, what is threat modeling? I'm not going to go into detail feel about that, because I think it's quite a straightforward thing. I would say that I'm not an expert in threat modeling, but what I have got is experience of trying to implement it at various different places. So it's basically analyzing representations of a system. So typically that could be like a diagram, a data flow diagram, or some sort of architecture diagram. You're basically decomposing it and analyzing it for threats and mitigations and countermeasures that you can. There is actually a threat modeling manifesto, just as there is like an agile manifesto. So it's kind of useful to know about that website if you're looking into threat modeling. And one of the sort of things it does is sort of say that you've got 4 key questions that when you're doing threat modeling, you ask about a system. So it is, what are we building? What can go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And did we do a good job? And to be honest with you, I mean, that could be kind of deemed as a sort of acceptance criteria. So almost like a minimum viable threat model could be literally asking those 4 questions about a particular sort of feature or user story. A little bit more detail. So you've got Microsoft. They're very keen on sort of defining threat modeling in such a way that they say it should be part of your routine development lifecycle, which is very much in line with the theme of this event today, and very much something that I've tried to do. So, kind of think about it as not being the preserve of cybersecurity, but something that should be almost like a self-serve model. So, you've got your development teams kind of owning this process themselves and carrying it out routinely, ideally, rather than sort of cybersecurity or relying on external consultants or, relying on the cybersecurity team to kind of do this for you. You want your kind of architecture team, your developers to actually do this themselves wherever possible. But what do you actually end up doing, with the threat model? It's kind of like you basically have to decide the scope. You could be looking at an entire system, or you could be just trying to sort of threat modeling a particular feature or release, or even just a simple user story. It could be broad or very finite. And so you typically will draw a diagram, typically a data flow diagram. You'll typically host a workshop, where you basically get people from like QA, or developers or architects, or even security representation, basically into the workshop, and you kind of like analyze this diagram, enumerate all of the different components, all the data flows, all the data stores, and sort of have a think about and a discussion about what kind of threats you foresee, and then you sort of ask yourselves, have we actually mitigated those threats? And if not, let's create some user stories to kind of, come up with a plan to sort of apply some remediation. There could be sort of, again, I don't really want to get into too much detail because, there's very different sort of approaches to threat modeling. You can kind of have steps in between that. You could argue this is oversimplified. You can go into a lot more detail than that. But I kind of want to just sort of give you that overview in case there's anyone here that's not familiar with threat modeling, so that I can get onto the kind of real sort of content that I want to get across. So what does that really mean in practice? Well, what we really want is for people to, development teams to have actually thought about security. So typically, you might be in a position where, previously they probably do threat modeling already, they just don't realize it. They're probably already asking, what are we building? Did we do a good job? They probably already do think about security, but it's useful to kind of formalize that. You want them to have demonstrated that they've probably drawn a diagram, kind of analyzed it, had different perspectives, different people's kind of looking at the diagram and sort of analyzing the threats, and coming up with a list of mitigations. So there's a really good blog actually from a company called Segment. I really like it. I do recommend you look at it. It's kind of called the self-service threat modeling approach, I think, and it's all about how you kind of, and I keep coming back to it, how you sort of like work with development teams to actually sort of self-service threat modeling, do it themselves internally, so it's not again the kind of preserve of cybersecurity as a specialist or anything like that. So they present this as a like a sample kind of threat model diagram, and it's just to illustrate the point more than anything that you draw a diagram. You've got various different components. You have to think about the threat actors, who uses the system. You've got trust boundaries, processes, data flows, data stores. But I'll be honest with you, this is not a typical system. A typical system is probably going to look a bit more like this, and possibly even more complex than that realistically. And if you ever sort of look at any sort of threat model, how-tos, don't be misled by the oversimplistic diagrams. It's nice that they sort of explain the concepts, but the point is that realistically you're going to be looking at something a whole lot more complex than a couple of data stores and a web. It's like a typical three-tier kind of web application. But to be honest with you, a threat model diagram could equally just be something that someone sketched, using a whiteboard, and that approach is okay too if you're in a development team. So that was the first section on hopefully covering off what threat modeling is at a high level at least. So what I want to touch on now is kind of the value of threat modeling. So this is sort of the key message that you would want to give to senior leadership in a team or the development folks in the organization you work at. So take a look at this diagram, this chart. So I think that the main point to draw here is that fixing sort of vulnerabilities, excuse me, I look at all the screens, so fixing defects is much less expensive when done earlier in a system lifecycle. So obviously, on the x-axis you've got the sort of relative cost, and then you've got the various different phases, and then you've got the relative cost as well. So I think the key point here is that, and this is a study from NIST, that the cost of fixing defects is much less the earlier you find them. So the question is, where would you do threat modeling ideally? I mean, it's clearly going to be sort of at the requirements and architecture section, I think. And that's not to say that threat modeling isn't applicable at any stage. You could do it post-production as well, post-release as well. But when a thing's in operation, it's going to be more costly to sort of make significant changes. So this is a useful chart, and I recommend that you kind of use it if you're ever in a situation where you need to implement threat modeling and kind of justify it to an organization. So another graph that I quite like, I've used this a few times as well, is this one. So it's kind of like, well, where are most of the defects introduced? So you've got like your software development lifecycle, if you like, along the bottom, like from coding through to release. You can see that, defects are introduced largely at the beginning and become more costly to repair towards the end. So I mean, use these charts, because genuinely, speaking to like VPs of engineering and such, this kind of like does sort of convert them somewhat into the idea that threat modeling is a good idea and holds value and holds weight. So another thing about the value of threat modeling, another thing that's worth mentioning is some of you here may have heard of the building security and maturity model. So it's kind of, I would sort of describe it as a descriptive approach to sort of application security. And the key point I want to draw out here is that it's kind of like a study. You get a report periodically released by BSIM. It describes what various different organizations and different verticals are doing. And threat modeling is pretty much always part of it. It's under the sort of intelligence domain, and it's always there. And another thing worth mentioning is standards such as NIST, SSDF, Secure Software Development Framework. Again, threat modeling is in there. I mean, pretty much everywhere you look, there's compliance sort of regulatory expectations that you'll do threat modeling. Then you've got, of course, OWASP SAM, the Software Assurance Maturity Model. So you have these different business functions. There's a design one, and there's a practice called threat assessment, and threat modeling is in there as well. But what does that actually look like in more detail? So you've got, like, in OWASP SAM, you've got 3 levels of maturity, with 1 being the lowest and 3 being the highest. So kind of like number 1 is your sort of ad hoc threat modeling, using existing diagrams and maybe being supported by like a list of threats, for example, that you might use. Most advanced type of threat modeling you might carry out is to be pretty much sort of doing it continuously and automating it, and you have your a methodology to back it up. So that's what it looks like. So when you're thinking about sort of the value of threat modeling, hopefully those charts are something that you could use to approach an organization with. And then of course you've got the various different compliance and maturity models and standards to justify it as well. And then you kind of know what basic threat modeling looks like versus more advanced threat modeling. but some of these, there are even regulations such as a transport one from the UN, UNR 155. Even within the regulation itself, like in the Appendix 5, you've actually got a list of threats. So there's multiple sources that you can use if you're trying to sort of do threat modeling. You've got some kind of sector-specific threats even listed in the standards themselves. So if you're kind of working with a development team, then you can actually draw on these resources and use it. And so if you're looking at a diagram thinking, well, what kind of threats could be applicable, the chances are the standard itself has a list that you can check. And obviously there's a number of OWASP checklists as well. So this side's kind of like, it's clearly a good idea to do threat modeling, isn't it? You've got regulations mentioning it. You're clearly defined kind of value benefits. You're reducing development teams' cost. You can demonstrate that. There's sort of NIST studies to back it up. You've got maturity models mentioning it. You've got checklists to support you. I mean, it's clearly a good idea. I mean, probably most people in this room who work, or are interested in cybersecurity would agree with that. But the trick is that the thing is that in my experience of working with different organizations, so there can be an expectation that cybersecurity will sort of do that for you. But, so trying to convince development teams in those organizations to do this, even though we all think it's a fantastic idea, it's sometimes even a regulatory requirement. It's actually quite a challenging thing. And that's really the sort of purpose of this talk, to go through some of those challenges and what you can do about it. So I've got a few sort of points on the tools involved as well with regards to threat modeling. I've had experience of using a fair few of them by now. And I'd just like to share some of those thoughts with you in case you actually find yourself in this position. But first, what are some very basic approaches? I mean, I've tried to keep it simple, but a minimum viable threat model is really just asking those 4 questions that we went through earlier on. And if you can get development teams to sort of routinely ask themselves those questions as part of user stories, as some sort of acceptance criteria, then that would be a very useful thing. And you could consider that a threat model. Some people think that some development teams might assume that threat modeling is drawing an extremely complex architecture diagram and analyzing that, but that is a threat model too, and that's probably number 3 there. But I would say the most common type of threat model to do is sort of a time-boxed exercise where you have maybe like a 90-minute meeting or a couple of those meetings, and you invite maybe 5 or 6 different people from different departments for different perspectives to kind of look at an architecture and try to figure out if they know where the skeletons are hidden, which often a lot of developers would do if they've worked on a project for a long time. So going back to the tools, so what have I used? So there's 3 types of options really. I would say even a whiteboard is a valid threat modeling tool. It's easy to think if you have to draw the diagram yourself. I mean, it's quite a difficult thing, isn't it? Sort of take a low-level diagram from an architect, and if you haven't been involved in working on it, to then sort of like that. There's something about kind of drawing it yourself or in a workshop and sort of processing your understanding of the system that you're trying to analyze. There's diagramming tools as well, like Visio, Draw.io. Again, they're valid. You don't have to necessarily use the dedicated threat modeling tool. But of course, there are a number of dedicated threat modeling tools which I'll offer a few opinions on. But this is from the Agile Manifesto, useful toolkit. So whatever you're using, should increase your productivity, right? I mean, that's the key point, right? Because some of these threat modeling tools, extremely, sort of dedicated threat modeling tools, some of the more expensive ones, they don't, in my opinion, increase your productivity at all. In fact, I think they can hinder it, and I'll explain that. So looking at the whiteboards, I mean, you could pick anything really. You've got Miro, Microsoft Whiteboard. I mean, advantages are that it's pretty much a blank slate approach. Again, it's that forcing you to think about a system and sort of draw it yourself. It's nice to be in a room with, you've got a developer, you've got an architect, you've got maybe someone from cybersecurity, a QA tester, maybe a site reliability engineer or something like that. You can kind of challenge people's understanding of the system. and sort of say, well, that's not quite right, and have you considered the supply chain, the third-party systems, and so on. It's just very conducive. And in my opinion, if you've got an organisation that's not used to doing threat modelling, I think it's quite a good approach to sort of start light and just use something like a whiteboard tool, to be honest. The only disadvantage, though, is that if you're trying to sort of come up with threats and mitigations that these are not tools, obviously, that will generate them, and obviously some of these threat modelling tools will automatically sort of generate threats and countermeasures for you. And it's a very similar situation with regards to the drawing tools. So I remember working with one organisation, and they said, well, why don't we standardise on Lucid chart. All of our architects create their sort of architecture diagrams in Lucid chart. Why don't we just do threat modelling using Lucid chart? And that's not a bad idea. You've got all the right sort of shape templates that's used by the organisation. If it's a more advanced kind of organisation with a large architecture team, for example, then you're avoiding duplicated effort because the architects have already got the diagrams. You can reuse them. You can maybe kind of create an extra tab and convert them if you need to, and sort of create data flow diagrams and analyze that. That's a valid thing to do as well. But they don't generate the threats and countermeasures that dedicated threat modeling tools will do. Now on these dedicated tools, there are quite a few different types around these days. Here's a few examples. So you've got OWASP Threat Dragon. Obviously, shout out to Mike Goodwin for making that. I used to work for him at Sage. I think he did a good job there. But then you've got the Microsoft threat modeling tool. You've got Irius Risk, if you've heard of that. You've got threatmodeler.com. You've got SD Elements. There's more than that as well. But these are all kind of dedicated threat modeling tools that offer functionality over and above what you get from like a whiteboarding tool or just a standard sort of drawing package. And they're very feature rich. One of the key things that they do for you is basically you draw your diagram, and then they kind of like generate from a database a set of. They basically carry metadata in all of the shapes and stencils, and they'll generate a number of threats and associated mitigations for you to consider. Which could be quite useful, couldn't it? Because if you're new to threat modeling, you think, well, here's a tool that's going to give me a list of threats, so I don't need to think of them myself. You might naturally think that that's a useful thing to have. But I also think it's a bit of a negative as well, and the reason for that is it's well, I'll get into that in a minute. So there's lots of features. You can have. They integrate with issue trackers like Jira or Azure DevOps. Vulnerability managers like Defect Dojo, and Thread Fix, and many others. You can create a lot of automation with the APIs that they expose. Role-based access control if you're in a large organization with many business units all doing threat modeling. It's good for collaboration. Some of these will do some very cool things like generate threat models from declaratives like infrastructure as code, so YAML files, JSON. It'll just take that and generate your diagrams for you. So there's quite a lot of potential for automation and an audit trail as well. If you're doing threat modeling as part of like a requirement to meet a standard or regulation, then having that audit trail of all of these systems can be useful too. And you can even do things like filter threats and countermeasures based on various standards like NIST, CSF, and so on and so forth, really. And so it can be used as a measure of compliance to a degree. But that all sounds great, but if you want my honest opinion, I think that some of these tools kind of introduce more problems than solutions. The reason for that is I think it's a security antipattern in many cases. And what I mean by that is that if you think about security tooling generally, static code analysis, dynamic application security testing, development teams are using these tools, and these tools are generating, so many false positives, so much noise. The signal-to-noise ratio is really quite poor, and my experience of using some of these tools is very similar, and I've seen the development teams not respond well to them as well. So for example, you draw in one of these. I won't name the tools because I don't want to get in trouble, but basically, if you do a very small diagram, like a 3-tier sort of web app, you're still going to get over like 100 threats and mitigations generated by the tool, which someone has to sift through and make sense of. And the wording can be so off-kilter or abstract, or there's lots of redundancy. I think that these tools have a long way to go in terms of being assisting with the productivity claims that the threat modeling manifesto really expects you to sort of achieve with the threat modeling tools. So I'm not a huge fan unless you have a really specific, advanced client with a really strong cybersecurity team, and maybe something like a very good security champions program. Those are the only scenarios where I'd see these tools being particularly useful, I think. You want to be in a position where you introduce these tools, which are very expensive as well in some cases, to then have to struggle to operationalize them and to be basically approaching development teams with yet another security tool that's going to give them even more false positives to look at. And so they probably hate you even more as a cybersecurity function. I think they would rather you sort of actually solve some of their problems for them with their existing tooling than sort of introduce something new like this. But they have their place, I'm sure. I just haven't found one. And the APIs sometimes can be poorly implemented. So you're trying to create some automation, which I have done. And sometimes the variable names and sort of data models don't match what you see in the UI, and the UI is not great either. And the more time you spend with them, the more you realize where they might be useful, but are not. There are other types of tools available, such as, which I'll be honest, haven't really used. There's tools like Threagile, which kind of are almost entirely based on YAML declarative descriptions of infrastructure as code, and that I see a lot of potential in that area, but I'm not going to offer too much of a view on that because I haven't personally used them. But they're perfectly valid tools as well to explore. Okay, so I've kind of hopefully given a reasonable overview of what threat modeling is and explained the value of it and how you might sort of sell that value to development teams. I've tried to explain a little bit about and various different views on them. But now let's have a bit of a think about the sort of challenges posed by development teams. So you all think it's a great idea. You think you've picked the right tool for the kind of culture and working practices that you're faced with. But then you still need to go to the development teams, or it could be a VP of product engineering, for example. You need to sell this idea. Imagine you're working in the security function doing that. And this is the kind of thing that you might come across. So I've tried to create a bit of a scenario here. So maybe you're an application security manager, for example, or a consultant. Everyone in security thinks it's a great idea. They've seen the charts that we've just looked at. We're going to help teams to reduce the cost of security. We're going to respect their value streams, their lead times, their process times. We're helping them. Cost. We're helping them to look good with securely designed systems. So you speak to the security senior management, and you generally will find that you'll get agreement that this is a good idea. But when it actually comes to it, you might find a team that will sort of humor you somewhat. They'll do you a favor. Yes, we'll listen to security, but maybe they'll do a threat model with you, but they may never do it again. And that's always the risk with these things. And other teams, and you see it quite a lot, or maybe it's just me. But you just frankly haven't got time for that. I'll just sort of stare at you blankly and say that I haven't got spare time to do threat modeling. I'll video out, sort of explain. So these are the kinds of arguments that you'll hear, the teams are already busy. We've got tough targets. We haven't got any capacity for this. We weren't expecting this. It's unplanned. We have strict targets to achieve. It's not in my goals. Threat modeling is not in my goals. I don't understand threat modeling yet. There's no policy that means I have to do it. That's another one. There's no process established. So how can you expect me to do it? Nobody's been trained on it. We don't have a security champions program. So there's no one to help us. The security team, you operate like a silo. You're just telling us to do stuff. We have to do this. Um, don't give us yet another thing. Also, you guys in security are lacking credibility. What can you teach us? You don't have engineers. You're sort of maybe governance, risk, and compliance types. And only that. So, that developer empathy might not be there because of that, is what I'm trying to say there, as opposed to like governance and compliance as well. I did actually used to work in a compliance team, so I'm not insulting myself. But I mean, security might not get DevOps. They might, they're probably living in a different world, the development teams. You're wanting them to own this threat modeling process, but, they're doing their sprint planning. They're grooming their sprints, their user stories, and sort of prioritizing stuff and having their retrospectives and agile ceremonies, and etc. But you might not be sort of living in that world in security, maybe not. If you are, good. They think that security should just do it for them, and frankly, the static code analyzer doesn't work for them, and they don't enjoy the pen tests or the audits. So hopefully that's not too devastating a picture. It kind of reminds me a bit like this, if anyone's seen this before. This is actually a genuine kind of poster, but you could kind of replace the word from a key recon in New Zealand quite some time ago now. It's been used in a lot of talks. I'm not the first person to use it. Lots of people use this before. You could replace the word hackers with developers when you're trying to approach them with like new security things. If it's really not going well for you. And maybe you'll get it on the backlog, but you know what? It might never get into the sprint. So that can happen too. And I've seen that happen actually. I've actually seen that happen because I managed to find a really sort of eager team, and they were like, "Yeah, we'll definitely do a threat model. I'm really up for this." And it sat in the backlog for weeks, and I was like, "You're going to do it then?" I ended up kind of like joining their sprint planning session to explain quite a lot to them. And it did actually get done, but if I didn't do that, if I didn't nag them, it wouldn't have happened. So that's the kind of situation you can be up against sometimes. And so the final section then, doing my best to finish on time, is what can you do about responding to these kind of challenges? These are some of the things that have sort of worked for me in the past. So first of all, getting the top-down buy-in. So kind of think about the organizational objectives. Security is going to be in there somewhere. You need to align what your program is to that, but you also need to think about quality as well. Security can be deemed to be part of quality, and therefore, if you're kind of creating a new process and trying to sell the idea of threat modeling to a product engineering team, then try to align with the organizational goals or behaviors or values even, if you have to, and kind of think about how it maps to that when trying to explain the value. And use those charts as well about sort of trying to explain the cost savings of threat modeling. But also, it sounds a bit harsh, requirement, if one doesn't exist on a secure software development policy. I've been involved in a couple of organizations where they didn't have one, or they were updating one. They introduced threat modeling as a requirement. And so, unfortunately, I know it's a stick rather than a carrot, but further down the line, they'll be able to say, well, it's actually a requirement. You have to do this. And so you have to sort of be involved with the process of updating policies and within the organization, and make sure you know the right stakeholders for that. But also you need to have do a bit of research and figure out how your development teams actually work on a day-to-day basis. Understand their sort of workflows, their value streams, how they prioritize work. If you understand how they prioritize work, you've got a much better chance of introducing something to them and getting it sort of past that sort of gate, if you like. I would genuinely speak to the product owners as well in particular, because they can be the gatekeeper for new work. And also try to demonstrate the value with smaller teams at first, sort of key teams. If there is no security champions program, that's unfortunate. You could be involved in setting one up. That's basically having like a security point of contact in development teams that are not security experts, but have some sort of responsibility for security. But usually you'll find some people that have done threat modeling before in the organization, and it's a good idea to find out who they are and to try to work with them and figure out what worked for them and what didn't work for them, and sort of take it from there. Going up a little bit, I think that sort of being part of the sort of working with the architects in particular for sort of where you've got a design authority such as an architecture review board, having a step for threat modeling in that process with the architects is a key idea as well. Capture metrics as well. Capture metrics such as, and some of the tools are quite good for capturing metrics because they've got APIs. You can kind of pour the data from some tools into like a data lake and then basically query that data lake and present some useful statistics in something like a Power BI dashboard. You can show various things such as which business units have started to do threat modeling, how long it took them to do it. You want to get that figure down, and so on. And so you can kind of have a measure of like the adoption and coverage of threat modeling in the organization. And that, if you're kind of tasked with doing this, you've probably got a CISO somewhere that wants you to prove that you're making some progress with the product engineering function. And so, being in a position where you can say, well, we've gone from sort of 10% coverage to 25% in a couple of years is kind of a useful thing. And provide the right kind of support. Don't just be that the security team just asks for stuff and expects it to happen. Sort of create training, buy training, procure training. There's lots of open source training even available. Even stuff like LinkedIn Learning has some excellent stuff from the likes of Adam Showstack that you can, and a lot of organizations do provide LinkedIn Learning to their staff. And there's probably a developer portal as well in your organization. And so don't put stuff on SharePoint and expect them to go there. They probably use their developer portal or a wiki or whatever. So try to sort of understand where they get their sort of engineering information from, and sort of make sure that the processes and guidance live there, not on SharePoint or something. And kind of ease them into it. Don't go in too harsh instead of in the sense of sort of expecting like a full threat model straight away. Allow them to just use a whiteboard and just ask those 4 key questions to begin with, and count that as a threat model. Otherwise, you might alienate them and overwhelm them with presenting them with too much to do too soon. And of course, celebrate achievements as well. I've been in organizations where they kind of recognize people through like the CISO awards. I've seen that before. So maybe like all members briefings or all hands meetings. Someone who's done a threat model, they'll kind of explain that, get to celebrate that. There might be like security days that you have in an organization, and maybe you can kind of, in the future, get some of the people who've done threat models to explain how they did it as a talk of their own. And really important for me, avoid the security anti-patterns. Don't be that security team that brings another security tool that doesn't work for anyone. Think carefully about introducing an expensive tool that's going to generate a lot of noise that people might not understand, even if it is automated. And of course, if you find yourself, and it's quite common to find yourself in an organization that's already bought a whole bunch of security tooling, they might not be using it optimally. Well, often you'll find in the vendor contracts that there's actually an element for support there. So you can in fact sort of, people maybe not using the customer success team as much as they could, to sort of invite them in and do some talks for you, or maybe even deliver some training. It does actually happen. I've seen that a couple of places where they've bought an expensive tool and there's been training packages that have not been used internally. So you can actually get the software vendors in front of your developers to explain the tooling and how to use it really well. I'll end it there. So that's my last slide. So hopefully that was of interest, and I'll take any questions if I've got any time.
Well, just before questions, can we show our appreciation?
Thank you. Yeah, I've not done a talk since before COVID, so I was a bit nervous, to be honest, but thank you. Happy to take a couple of questions if anyone's got any.
Just on your last point on being on your vendors, one of the key things I find when you say it, health check, you ask your vendor for a health check, always free, for charging for it, they'll come in and give you your couple hours looking at your tooling, how you're using it.
Oh, right, okay.
That's the magic word I find.
Health check, okay.
Health check, normally if you've got any sort of third-party tool, they will come in, have a look at it, tell you it's working all fine, and they tell you if there's any issues with it, back in SQL, if there's issues there, if there's a front-end issue, they'll tell you what your issues are. They'll not fix them for free, they'll tell you how to fix them,
Yeah.
and then they'll upsell you your PS, but you'll normally find that a health check will give you that sort of initial, let's have a look at it, we'll tell you what it's like.
Okay. That's a good point, actually. Never really considered it in that way. Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah.
How do you use retrospectives? When an incident might have happened, you said, but if you broke that load, then you wouldn't have. Do you use that as a way of sort of like buy-in?
I haven't actually, but it sounds like a good idea. Yeah, if you could imagine, couldn't you, like some, you know, a retrospective after an incident, that would be a useful thing to do. So, you know, you could have found these flaws out much earlier. Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Yeah. Yeah, retrace your steps. What if you'd have done this? Maybe we wouldn't be here now. That kind of, yeah, it's an interesting point, actually. Yeah, it's worth thinking about, actually. Thanks, yeah. Oh, yeah, hi. All right, yeah. Yeah, I like the idea of that, you know, and just using existing meetings as well. Like if people are already having lightning talks, just introduce security to them rather than creating some separate security meeting that they have to come to. In other words, go to them rather than expecting them to come to you. Yeah, I like the idea of that. Yeah, exactly. Because it's different. It's interesting, isn't it? Because when you actually start talking to developers more closely, you realise that all of the previous sort of arguments and cases you put forward didn't quite work for them. They needed slightly different information. It kind of really is about empathy, really, to a degree. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Hi. Yeah, I mean, even just your sort of monthly retrospectives that you might have, you know, you could sort of, if you routine, actually. Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Well, I mean, threat modeling is kind of infrastructure as well and cloud as well as secure coding, isn't it? I mean, I do find that sometimes you user stories that to implement things that they're in control of. You know, if it's some code change, but then sometimes you have spikes for investigations into sort of areas beyond their control that they need to investigate. So it's kind of like a mix of user stories and spikes, really, depending on who's investigating it and whether they're in control of it or not. So it kind of rolls a bit like that, really. I think it's important to track it. What I'd say is that you should probably tag those user stories with threat modeling, so you can actually trace just how many user stories were created. You could run a report on that. That could sort of feed into your metrics.
Yeah, do you find it uncovers a lot of
well, you tend to find that people know where, you know, there's people sitting on information. You know, this gives them a bit of a chance of a sort of amnesty to. But I mean, there's no doubt that nobody has all the answers, and so there's a lot of sort of running around trying to figure things out and sort of recording that as a spike. Oh, thanks.
no further questions? Well,
Don't think so.
Thank you ever so much for coming.
That's all right. Thank you.